Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this panel discussion entitled Reclaiming Sustainable Infrastructure as a Public Good. It has been jointly organized by Eurodad, the Society for International Development, and COST, the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative. My name is Peter Matthews. I'm the Executive Director of COST and the Executive Director of Engineers Against Poverty. It's my pleasure to be the moderator for this event. This session forms part of the C20 Summit 2021, which is running between the 5th and the 8th of October and includes 25 virtual events. If you haven't already done so, I encourage you to go to the C20 website, browse the agenda, and consider joining other events too. We have assembled a very strong panel today with representatives from the G20 and C20. We were expecting Marco Roccia to join us. Marco is one of the G20 Infrastructure Working Group co-chairs, but unfortunately, he had to submit his apologies at the last moment, yesterday, in fact. Fortunately, the G20 is represented by Luisa Mimi, who's part of the team at the Italian G20 presidency. In a moment, I'm going to invite each of the panelists to speak for around 7 or 8 minutes. I believe they're going to use some slides, so there'll be some visuals. When the last speaker is finished, I will give the panelists an opportunity to respond to what the others have said and just encourage some interaction between them. I'd also like to reserve some time to take questions and comments from the audience. Now, I believe that most of the audience is watching through YouTube. If you have questions or comments, and both are acceptable, please put them in the comments section under the video. Myself and the panelists are on a different platform, but our wonderful technologists behind the scene are going to be forwarding them to us. So please listen intently and share your questions and comments with us, and I'll do my best to get through as many as we can. Okay, I now turn to our first speaker, Luisa Mimi, who is a senior advisor to the G7 G20 unit at the Ministry of Economy and Finance in the government of Italy. Luisa, over to you.
Here we go. Thank you very much. I hope you're seeing my slides correctly.
We are, yes.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really happy to be here to join this discussion. I will only offer some very brief remarks, choosing some of what I consider the most relevant deliverables under the Italian presidency. Just to introduce, I want to recall one of the most important achievements under the Infrastructure Working Group, which was the endorsement of the G20 principles on quality infrastructure investment. As you all know, the endorsement was in 2019 under the Japanese presidency, but I mention this because until now, the QII principles have remained like a North Star, so they orient much of the subsequent work that has been done by the Infrastructure Working Group, which basically continues to unpack the principles and look for concrete ways in which to translate the principles into policy recommendations. And by the way, in my view, QII principles is just another name for sustainable infrastructure, no? Which we all understand as this ideal that combines multiple dimensions, no? The social, the environmental, and the economic sustainability, which is to be secured over the life cycle of infrastructure assets. So there is also this long-term perspective that I think is a very important theme. And also there are the governance and institutional implications necessary to go towards this goal. Anyway, as I was saying, and maybe you all know, the Italian agenda was quite large and ambitious for this year. But also, in the interest of time, I will just mention two work streams that I believe can be especially interesting for this audience. So the first one is the resilience and maintenance work stream. And here what you see basically are just the most important documents and the main deliverables under this work stream. Why did we decide to focus especially on the topic of maintenance, which in a way always goes a little bit, it's left out of the conversation. We moved from this consideration that in the debate about the infrastructure investment gap, you all probably are familiar now with these huge figures that are estimated, but one thing that most people don't realize is that these investment gap estimates refer to almost always to new capital investment, whereas there is another gap to fill, which is necessary funding to secure that the existing infrastructure is kept in good working order, or that there are the necessary conditions to be prepared to risk. Why is this relevant? Because negligence of maintenance, which is something that developed and emerging countries have in common, result in costs that, even though they are not always very clear or out in the open, but these costs are borne by families, by small enterprises, and the economic system as a whole. So moving from this consideration, basically, we worked on trying to understand the specific challenges, including the knowledge gap challenges, and then we developed a G20 policy agenda, which was endorsed in July. And I invite you to look at it and also to consider the accompanying documents, because there is some valuable evidence that corroborates our findings, including the annex, which reports maintenance case studies implemented by member countries. The second and last work stream that I want to spend a couple of words on is what we called the inclusive infrastructure work stream. Here again, I think the Italian presidency brought something, a kind of a novelty in the debate of the G20, because we decided to include and engage in a dialogue with local authorities. The key moments were the organization of 2 workshops and a high-level conference, which we just held, thank God, in presence in Genoa a little over a week ago. Again, why this is relevant can be interesting also to your audience, because infrastructure assets are intrinsically connected with a territory, with a specific area, with a specific geography, morphology, demographic patterns. And so we wanted to acknowledge that subnational entities, regions, city, in fact, we had mayors and governors at our workshops and conference. They are the ones that are closer to the citizens, that know more exactly what are their needs, and often are also held more strictly accountable to them. So once again, I wanted to provide some links. The videos from these past events are accessible. And I think it was very impressive. And also G20 delegates appreciated the value of receiving directly from subnational entities their views, understanding their specific challenges, but also see all the innovative projects that they have implemented. And I will stop here, and I'm happy to respond to more questions later. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Luisa. I think you've done a very effective job of giving a kind of an overview, a roadmap of the main initiatives that the G20 Infrastructure Working Group have been working on recently. So I'm encouraging the audience to help us maybe unpack those through some questions and comments, and I'm sure we would like to explore them in a little bit more detail. I must say personally, I'm particularly pleased to see that the Infrastructure Working Group has come out with the agenda around maintenance. I think it's something that has been ignored for far too long. And with the economic crash of 2008 and the more recent economic downturn, for a while I've been extremely concerned that cutbacks in public spending has had a real impact on infrastructure maintenance. And I'm worried that that's in the system and we're going to feel the ill effects of that. So I'm very pleased to see that agenda coming out and congratulate the G20 on that. So thank you very much, Luisa. I now turn to our next contribution is a joint effort by Maria Jose Romero, who is the Policy and Advocacy Manager at Eurodad, and Flora Sonking, who is the Policy Researcher at the Society for International Development. I know that your respective organizations have been doing some work around this theme recently, and you're going to share some of the results and findings with us. So I'm not sure who's going first, but Flora or Maria, please take the floor.
Hello, good morning to everyone. Thank you very much, Peter, for the introduction, and to Lisa for her remarks. It's a pleasure to participate in this session with you all today. And as Peter said, we have been working with Society for International Development and partners from the global north and south on the issue of infrastructure. We have been monitoring the C20 agenda on infrastructure finance for some years now. We have engaged in the Civil 20 quite actively, and we have also contributed to all these discussions. And from this point of view is that we have been trying to engage on a discussion on what sustainable infrastructure actually means and how to ensure that it is delivered. And certainly we welcome the participation of the G20 representative today, and last year we had a very interesting discussion as well. Today we are launching a report with SEED and partners from North and South with the title Reclaiming Sustainable Infrastructure as a Public Good. This report, it's online now, and it's accompanied by 7 case studies from which we draw key insights. You can see the logos of the organization your screen now. I guess that we are projecting, but if not, we can do that very shortly. I'm sorry about that. My colleague Flora, I think that will do that. These are emblematic infrastructure projects implemented across different regions. We are presenting 5 cases that shine a light on problematic infrastructure projects. These were projects designed to attract private investment in infrastructure. And we also include 2 other cases that illustrate alternative approaches to infrastructure financing and development. It's also very important to present to you today what is our starting point for the discussion on infrastructure finance, in particular for sustainable infrastructure. We examine sustainable infrastructure from or through the lens of 4 interconnected pillars, the ones that you are seeing now. These are the social, ecological, governance, and economic pillar. And we define sustainable infrastructure as a structure or facility that is planned, designed, constructed, operated, and monitored in a transparent, participatory, and context-appropriate way, contributes to national and local priorities, extends access to services, paves the way to a just transition towards sustainable and climate resilient economies, and is financed in a transparent and sustainable way, meaning that it does not lead to unsustainable debt. In our report, we pay special attention to the prevailing narrative on infrastructure finance and how the economic pillar impacts those other three pillars. So you will see that we pay special attention to that. And now my colleague Flora will get into our views on our framing of sustainable infrastructure. Flora, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Maria Jose. Sorry, I'm having some screen sharing technicality issues. But yeah, as Maria Jose mentioned, in this report, we look at sustainable infrastructure from this systemic and holistic perspective. And I think some of the dimensions were also mentioned by Luisa, which I'm glad to hear. But we also, okay, how am I able then to see my presentation as a presenter and then share the slides? Because I'm looking at my notes. Yes. Maria Jose, can you please share your screen then?
Yes, I will do that, no worries.
Okay, thanks. Sorry about that. Is everyone able to see now?
We can't see them yet. It'll take a moment to upload, I think.
You can continue and I will share.
Okay, great. So as I was saying, framing sustainable infrastructure from a systemic perspective, on top of this 4 different pillars that we're looking at, we're also not looking at infrastructure just as the facilities themselves, but also in how they enable and maintain a different sort of development paths. For instance, based on large-scale production or extraction, like the mine, forest, or farm-to-port model, in integrating developing countries into global value chains, or in another dimension, a model based on local priorities and economic diversification and territorial markets. And this is what we're trying to see through the reports, that not all types of investment or not all types of capital will lead to the same kind of development path. And just as much, not all types of infrastructure contribute to supporting a socioeconomic transformation that many developing countries are looking for. And one of the issues that we look into the report is how the mainstream economic thinking that looks at how governments should be operating as facilitators for private investment, and that those private investments in infrastructure would then serve as an engine to economic growth. It means oftentimes that states need to have profitable projects in their pipeline, which then really shapes their development agenda in a way that we question whether that might lead to a maintenance of this export-led model and commodity dependence and integration into global value chains versus really having projects that responds to people's local priorities and needs, which might be projects that are not necessarily as marketable and profitable economically for private investors. So In the report, we look into this critical perspective and assumptions of this narrative that private investments are always good for development and for sustainable infrastructure development. I won't go into all of the points. I would just encourage you to read more in the report, but just sharing with you here some of the assumptions that we'll look into, like the public financing methods are incapable of filling a so-called financing gap, and that governments and multilateral development banks should be de-risking private investments to attract and facilitate more the crowding in of private finance. More private finance is inherently good, and finally that private finance will be allocated in a way that supports the SDGs and reaches all the most marginalized people. Go check out the reports to read more about how we unpack some of these assumptions. And finally, we then provide that, of course, considering the private sector is going to be important to deliver on the SDGs and focusing on private investment. I mean, attracting private investment and infrastructure is not inherently bad, but what we question is that mobilizing private capital should not be a goal in itself. And that a focus on these financing gaps actually misses the point of the structural challenges that need to be tackled in the long term. If we are to talk about infrastructure as a public good and actually fixing this financing gap in the long term. So in this discussion, we actually say, we provide in the report that we think that at least 3 dimensions need to be considered if we are to fill in this financing gap in the long term. And those are the fiscal and policy space, public investment, and industrial policies. And we see them as completely interlinked. And so in terms of policy, fiscal and policy space, we bring about the idea that we really need to have systemic solutions that are addressing the barriers to domestic resource mobilization by countries in the global south. And these include, for instance, debt cancellation measures, addressing tax abuse and illicit financial flows, which very much needs international cooperation for that, and financial sector regulations and capital market controls. All of these would be measures that can enhance developing countries' fiscal and policy space. And the second dimension, we talk about how it is important to reclaim the role of public investment banks, as particularly they can play a countercyclical role in the financing of sustainable infrastructure projects. And thirdly, we talk about how promoting industrialization policies is really important if we want to diversify economies and in turn overcome the policies that have been hampering developing countries' capacity to diversify and overcome commodity dependence in the past decades. So we think all of these are really important if we want to consider transforming infrastructure as a public good and using that agenda as an opportunity for socioeconomic transformation. I'll hand it back to MJ if we have time to look into our policy recommendations, but otherwise we can circle back to that after the next round of exchange. Thank you.
Thank you, Flora. I think at least temporarily we've lost our next speaker, Adrian. I don't see him in the list. I know he's joining from Zimbabwe and had some concerns about his internet connection. My suggestion would be, MJ, I'm sorry, I think you've removed the presentation. I wonder, given that Adrian isn't with us, if you should maybe just spend a couple of minutes on your policy recommendations. Would that be okay? Could you maybe show the presentation again and just go over the last slide and take us through the policy recommendations? And then hopefully by the time you've gone through that, Adrian will be back with us.
Yes, Thank you very much. I'm sorry that I did that too soon. So yes, as Flora said, this is the framing that we present in the report, and we think that civil society organizations have a very important role to play to reclaim infrastructure as a public good. And as I said at the beginning, we are trying to be active in spaces like the C20 and others to communicate these ideas. And we are also trying to work with our colleagues from the North and South to move this agenda forward at different levels. With regards to our recommendations, we are putting together three main pillars or points for us to move this conversation. And the first one is to scale up publicly financed infrastructure, particularly in social sectors. We think that publicly financed infrastructure is cheaper than privately financed, is less risky, and can be directed towards social sectors. And there is a need to put in place a very ambitious international plan to mobilize domestic resources to be able to do that. And some of the ideas shared by Flora in her remarks can be on the table because there is a need to get commitments at the international level to deliver on, for instance, official development assistance in terms of quantity and quality, tackling tax abuses from multinational companies. What we are seeing today of these papers, the Pandora papers, now actually show that there is a massive amount of money that have to be used for national needs. The second key block of recommendations that we put together have to do with rethinking the promotion of private finance for infrastructure. We firmly believe that going for an agenda mostly focused on developing infrastructure as an asset class and attracting private investors run the risk of undermining the very first objectives that we are trying to achieve, which are the SDGs and commitments to tackle climate change. So we think that the private sector and private investors have a role to play, and they can play a role, but under circumstances that allow for them to work under the guidance of national priorities in a transparent and democratically controlled way. The state has to retain its power to regulate in the public interest. So there is quite a lot to do to make that happen, and as I said, in the public interest. And thirdly, we think that it's very important to improve the quality and the sustainability of infrastructure, including its systemic considerations. And here we include quite a lot on what resilient infrastructure means, how can we improve the governance of infrastructure, the transparency standards of infrastructure, etc. So we have quite a lot of these in our report, and we are very happy to see that this year C20 presidency have taken some of these ideas, and we are ready to engage on how to make our agendas as close as we can, because we think that there is quite a lot for us to discuss and engage. Unfortunately, we have not been able to take a very careful look of the July papers that Luisa presented, just to advance some of my reactions to Luisa's point, just because our report closed a bit before that this has been the case. So thank you very much, and ready to engage in the next round. Over to you, Peter.
Well, thank you very much, Flora and MJ, for giving us that overview of your recent work. And I think you said that the report has been published today. So if people want to go and find it, I presume they'll be able to find it on your respective websites. And the title of the report is the same as the title that we've adopted for this session. So I encourage people to go and look at that. Now, I regret that our next speaker, Adrian Chikware, has at least temporarily dropped off. So I'm hoping that he will be able to rejoin us. He did say, actually, he was slightly concerned about his internet connection. So hopefully Adrian will join us and we will return to his presentation. But we have got a few moments now to have some interaction between the panelists. I'll just give a reminder to anyone watching on YouTube. Do put your questions and comments in the comments section under the video, and our wonderful technicians will forward them through to me, and I will do my best to put them to the panelists. So please do that. So there's some time for interaction. It's clear from the presentations that we've had that there is some overlap between the approaches of civil society on the one hand and the G20. And that's always good, because where there's room to work together, we are much more likely to succeed, I think. So the emphasis on sustainability around raising quality standards, the importance of maintenance, there's lots of areas where there's overlap. So that's very positive, I think. But clearly there are some differences. Perhaps the most obvious one is the emphasis on private or public investment. Now, I know from previous discussions that on neither side of this debate do we go to the extremes. I haven't heard anyone from civil society arguing that there's no role for private investment. And equally, I know that colleagues in the G20, who are governments, after all, do recognize the importance of public investment and the role of the public sector. But clearly, it's a question of emphasis there. So I might turn to you first, Luisa, if I can, on that topic, or anything else that you've seen in the presentation, actually. Do you see that what's been presented is more or less consistent with the G20's position? Is there anything you'd like to pick up or question or comment on what you've seen?
Yeah, so I'll start by saying that I also received the report this morning, so I only had a chance for a quick for skimming it through. But I think there are a lot of interesting points, and so first of all, I also just want to recall that the G20 has a rotating presidency, and so a lot of the things in the agenda also have a longer history than just the Italian presidency. So, I mean, I agree with you. In the past, starting from the Australia and then, you know, the Argentinian presidency in 2018 gave a huge input to, I mean, which simplifying a lot is, okay, we have this gap, this infrastructure investment gap, which, like I was saying before, that is also something that we need to dig in deeper, no, and qualify better, because those estimates I was mentioning before, one flaw, no, that is, for example, they don't take into account the maintenance side. But in any case, so the story goes like this. We have this gap, this funding need, and then on the other side, we have a lot of potential, you know, sources of financing that are there, and investors that are willing to invest. So that's one part of the story. And I also, you know, I also believe that neither of the extreme views is the complete story, right? I also wanted to point out that in your title, you say reclaiming as a public good, right? But what I was curious to see is, okay, talking about public goods, which, by the way, it has its also little question marks, because infrastructure cannot really be defined as pure public good. But in any way, I understand that you use this idea to point out the, let's call them the positive externalities, right? But what are the implications in terms of who is providing, regulating, and monitoring the quality? No, because there is, I think maybe you're focusing more on publicly financed infrastructure, but for me, the real pain point is more the regulation side of it. And I clarify with an example. I'm thinking of highway concessions. No, in Italy, we had a very tragic event, which was the collapse of the Genoa bridge, right? We were just in Genoa and we discussed that a lot. Yes, that part of the highway was under concession, which neglected its duties. But then on the other side, who was supposed to monitor that? No, so there is no, I don't see a guarantee that if the public sector is in charge, owns, then the monitoring side is performed correctly. So I will just stop here, but just to launch a possible question there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Luisa. I'm going to invite MJ and Flora to come back in. Just before I do that, I've got a message that our next speaker, Adrian, is in the waiting room. So if our technical team could allow Adrian into the platform, please, and we'll hopefully return to him and see his presentation. But Flora and MJ, please respond to what Luisa has said and the way that she's described the role of the public sector in relation to monitoring and overseeing quality, amongst other things.
Thanks. I can take this one. Thank you very much for the comments. It's indeed very important point that we try to incorporate in our analysis by having a focus on the governance aspect and on the role that the state has to play through the life span of the projects, from the decisions of going for a particular project to the monitoring phase of the project, and how the state is actually empowered to take decisions that that ensure that the public interest is followed through the whole process. We certainly think that the financing aspect is one central aspect, but as I said, it's not the only one, and we are happy to see that there is an emphasis in this year's presidency on points like this. So I will leave it like this, because I would like to hear the experience from the ground that our colleague Adrian from Eurodad has to share with us from his research. Thanks.
Thank you very much, MJ. I hope there will be some time to return to that and other questions. But I'm pleased that our next speaker, Adrian Chikaware, has rejoined us. Adrian, we temporarily lost you. My apologies for that, for the technical problems. But we are now able to see you on the screen. So if you could please share your presentation with us, please.
Hi, Peter. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we are able to see it. Yeah.
Okay, that's perfect. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. And maybe I should just start by highlighting what Louise highlighted with regards to resilience and maintenance of infrastructure. I just had a blackout, and it actually affected internet connectivity, as it were. But be that as it may, I'll take this opportunity to make my submissions on reclaiming sustainable infrastructure as a public good using the Nkala Road corridor, which is basically a 5-phase mega regional enterprise logistical project developed to enhance regional connectivity in Southern Africa. And ideally, this is aimed at also enhancing the integration of the region into the global trade. Be that as it may, this project spans across around 1,160 kilometers of road construction and rehabilitation, as well as the construction of one-stop border posts between Malawi and Zambia, as well as between Malawi and Mozambique. It is structured as a PPP, where there is a user pay model, which is being used for service fees for the one-stop border post, as well as the toll gates that were developed. In terms of the actors, we see the Africa Development Bank being one of the major financiers through loans that came through the Africa Development Bank. But we also see a number or a couple of G20 players, both states and IFIs, as well as development partners, in the name of the Korea Exim, the Japanese Investment Cooperation Agency, as well as the European Union Africa Investment Platform. And so to say, when the project started, it was costed at around 540 million, but due to a couple of delays and other technical challenges that face the project, currently it stands at 685 million, and this excludes interest and contingent liabilities charged on failure or delays to raise counterpart funds. In terms of other actors, especially on the construction and rehabilitation side, we see that the Nkala Road development corridor is highly characterized by Chinese construction companies. I think they constitute at least 71% of all construction and rehabilitation that is taking place from Zambia into Mozambique, going to the Nkala port. And then when we looked at the impacts, I think one important thing to highlight is whenever a project is implemented, there are positive and negative implications to a project. So I think the illustration, yeah, if you can see, that is it. You'd realize that prior to having the Nkala Road corridor, the roads, or the road network was highly characterized by dirt and gravel roads, but with the coming of and the investment into the Nkala Road corridor, you realize the roads are tarred, they are better off than what they used to. And this has had a positive impact on beneficiaries, as they have witnessed reduced travel time, transport cost savings, shorter turnaround time for international cargo freight, as well as improved accessibility for communities to social services and markets. But however, there are also a couple of negative implications that we've observed as a result of the Nkala Road development corridor. And basically, this speaks to social, environmental, as well as economic impacts per se. On the negative impacts on local communities and the environment, we've observed illicit logging of trees in one province called Tete, as the construction of one road called the Kuamba Mandimba Lichinga section of the project, which is in Nyasa province, where we have seen that Mozambican forests that provide food, firewood, employment, and protect farmland have been disappearing at the rate of over 80,000 hectares per year since 2000, when the corridor was initiated. And this has in turn exacerbated hardships for the people of Mozambique, particularly the rural populations facing severely limited employment and livelihoods opportunities. And we've also observed an extractivist model through the development of this infrastructure project, where basically raw materials are being extracted from the hinterland, mainly Zambia and partly Malawi, and being transported to the coast, to the Nkala port. And we've observed that there is limited value addition of these resources. And basically this then speaks negatively to the economic growth of the countries involved, as well as the region, the sub-region as a whole, the SADC region. And this is pretty much problematic, as the infrastructure development is probably categorized as an asset class where basically profits over people are basically at the core. More so, we've also witnessed that the corridor has instigated a wave of farmland grabs. And within this sphere of things, we see Chinese, Japanese, and tech-haven linked multinational companies taking center stage, especially in the agricultural sector, using the road network to transport farm produce or raw farm produce for value addition, either in China, the Middle East, as well as mainland Europe. More so, given the model that the project takes, the user pays model, we've also observed that tax bases for revenues towards national budgets for Malawi and Mozambique were broadened, and the burden fell on taxpayers' shoulders. And these have included revised and increased road and toll fees, as well as licensed managed under the respective road authorities within Malawi and Mozambique. We have over time been highlighting the implications of PPPs on democratic accountability. And for this specific project, PPPs undermine democratic accountability on agreements and contracts, as there is limited consultation and contract disclosures. So in as much as we profiled the environmental and social impact assessment studies, which were carried out using the AFDB standards, we actually realized that consultations with local communities, especially those within the project areas, were ad hoc and non-comprehensive, and also access to information was skewed to the benefit of the development partners and private sector entities rather than the communities impacted. And here I think we can speak to the governance issues on the part of the public sector. And then most importantly, on the social/environmental aspect, is the challenges that we've noticed with the resettlement and compensation plans that were exhibited within this project, where resettled or relocated communities did not get what they deserved at par for the livelihoods they lost, the land they lost when they were being moved to other areas to pave way for the construction of this infrastructure development. More importantly, though, is the fact that African continent and also the sub-region being Southern Africa is probably in a debt crisis, and infrastructure developments of this nature are a cause for concern, because infrastructure development across sectors, in as much as I'm talking about the transport sector, some of the major drivers that increase debt stocks in the countries. In the case of Mozambique, I think we've, for some of us who have heard about the hidden loans within Mozambique, and probably now how Mozambique is now categorized as a country in debt distress. This is a cause for concern when infrastructure financing is skewed more on loans that are unsustainable. And more so, I think PPP transactions are usually off budget books, thereby they give a skewed or a biased debt sustainability analysis. So be that as it may, I think when we were developing the paper, we had a couple of call to actions where we highlighted the need to put people first in all infrastructure development interventions across sectors of the region and beyond. And this should be coupled with creating decent jobs, stimulating local economic development, protecting the environment, reducing inequality, promoting gender equality and social inclusion. And then secondly, we are of the view that the delivery of public infrastructure is largely a government obligation, and this is the time that government need to reclaim the space. However, we are alive to the fact that there is need to scale up publicly financed infrastructure, particularly in social sectors, as public financing is often less costly, more financially sustainable, and more directly accountable to citizens than private financing. And over and above, we call upon the IFIs, the international financial institutions, the G20, and donors to rethink the promotion of private finance for infrastructure, as we believe an infrastructure finance agenda focused on developing infrastructure as an asset class and promoting PPPs risks undermining progress on meeting the SDGs and National Development Plan targets. With this, I'll stop here, and thank you for giving me your ears. Thank you.
Adrian, thank you very much for your presentation. It does dovetail very nicely with the previous presentations, where you've really brought it down to a practical level at the kind of the front line. And you've highlighted a number of issues that came up briefly in the previous presentations around the challenges related to Chinese investment, the trade-offs that there often are, particularly in big infrastructure investments. The reality is that there are sometimes winners and losers. And it really is about anticipating and trying to understand them. And it's the political governance skills that are needed to manage that transition, where there will be some positive and negative impacts. And also the nature of PPPs and what is often the opaque nature of PPPs. I know from my own perspective, our colleagues in Cost Honduras have done some really fascinating work around making PPPs more transparent. So I encourage you to go to the Cost website and follow that through, and some work that we did around the World Bank in terms of publishing good practice in promoting transparency in PPPs. But it does remain a very significant challenge. Thank you very much, Adrian. That's dovetailed very well with the other presentations. We have about 9 minutes left, so I want to encourage a little bit more discussion. I also have a question from one of our colleagues who's watching through YouTube, and it's from Olive Kabutwere, who's in Uganda. And you'll forgive me, Olive, I hope, if I just paraphrase your question. Olive is asking about civil society space. And we know that in our experience in Cost, I'm sure with others, in many countries, with the rise of authoritarian governments, with populist governments, quite often we find that the space for civil society to operate, to ask the questions, to exercise accountability is being constrained. So I wonder, I throw this open generally to anyone who would like to take it. Any practical suggestions, any experience that you have, what your organization's thinking are for trying to protect and extend civic space so that civil society, NGOs, community-based organizations can articulate their needs and hold decision makers to account. Anybody like to come in on that one? Now, don't fight over the microphone. Anybody? Adrian, I hesitate. Oh, Flora, you've unmuted. Please come in.
Well, we don't have an organizational position on this, and it's hard to say because it's very different depending on context. But I'm originally from Brazil, and in our report we also have a case study from Brazil that specifically talks about the interactions between society and government. One way, and this is the example of our case study in Brazil, is that the civil society and the local communities found a much better entry point with local authorities than with national government, at least in the case of Brazil. As we know, we're struggling politically in the moment as well. With engagement of civil society with the national government, but we find that engagement at the local level is still possible. So I guess this is one example, but of course it's very context specific.
Well, I must say to some extent, at least Flora, that does chime with my own experience, where sometimes at a subnational level, I think it might be to do with physical proximity to decision makers. Now, you are able to interact sometimes a bit more effectively at a subnational level, be that a municipality or a town or a small city, for example. Flora, whilst we've got the microphone, I know that on our previous discussion, you were keen to come back in and respond to what Luisa said about the investment gap, the financing gap around infrastructure. So I'll ask you to be brief if you could, please, but if you would just like to address that point.
Yes, sure. Thanks, Peter. And thanks, Luisa, for raising this question of the financing gap and the need to look deeper into it. I fully agree. I think that if we take one step even deeper beyond, like, for instance, the issue of maintenance, I think the fact that there is a financing gap in itself is something that needs to be addressed at an international level. And the G20 for sure has a role to play in this, but what we as civil society, as SID, believe in is that this kind of decision makings, for instance, MJ mentioned the Pandora Papers, and this kind of decision makings, for instance, on international tax cooperation, that would have a huge role to play in closing this financing gap in a more longer term. They have to be taken at intergovernmental, truly universal process that we believe should happen at the UN as the only space where economic policy decisions can be discussed and debated, where developing countries have an equal seat at the table. And so, just to say that I think that the discussion on the financing gap should also go into debates around tax abuse and illicit financial flows and debt and all of these more systemic issues that constrain developing countries' capacity to fill in those gaps for themselves. But that for sure need international cooperation at the global level. Over.
Thank you very much, Flora. Given the constraints on time, Flora, that might be your final remark. I hope you don't mind. Luisa, I'm going to give you an opportunity to come back on that, and this will probably be your final remark. Then I'll give the panelists it'll need to be extremely brief, but just a final word. But Luisa, on that point, and any final remarks you'd like to make, please.
Well, I agree. I think, personally, I really think you have a great point. And this also relates to the work of other working group in the G20, as you know, in the infrastructure, financial architecture, the framework. So I join you in hoping that there is this broader look. I just will take this opportunity also to mention another deliverable of the infrastructure working group, which is the Infra Tracker. I don't know if you heard of it. This is a work that the Global Infrastructure Hub has done. And it's actually only been launched in September and hopefully will continue under the Indonesia presidency. So the idea was to take a look at the stimulus packages that have been committed for the recovery, and specifically what components of those. So we're talking about government spending and at least committed funds, the portion of those that is dedicated to infrastructure, and especially they have been trying to give a more detailed look at what kind of infrastructure project, which they are trying to understand those that have a transformative impact. So I encourage you to keep an eye on the Infra Tracker. It will be a digital tool, so they are very good at also making the data accessible. So keep an eye on the GIH website.
Thank you very much, Luisa. And you really are in the hot seat today, I think, because not only are you getting questions around the Italian presidency, it's also the previous presidencies, including Saudis, Japanese, going back to Argentina. So we do appreciate
Marco abandoned me, so I'm all alone.
Well, thank you for being in hot seat. We do appreciate it. MJ first, and then Adrian. I'm afraid it's just very briefly, 20 seconds, if there's a final point you'd like to make, please. MJ?
Yes, so thank you very much. We certainly appreciate this dialogue. The discussion on infrastructure and of sustainable infrastructure is going to be at the center of recovery packages, and it's the right thing to do, because infrastructure will serve us to get closer to deliver on the SDGs, on Paris, etc. How we understand the role of the public and the private sector, it's a key question for us to keep discussing. Infrastructure for whom, who benefits from the infrastructure. This is another question that we address in our report, and it's very, very important because this has to be at the service of people. And finally, we welcome the inclusion of this inclusive infrastructure agenda under the Italian presidency, and we really look forward to getting into those discussions, the views of people from the ground. So getting local authorities, it's a step forward, but we really need the views of people from the ground. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, MJ. Adrian, I apologize. As a result of your technical difficulties, you have been squeezed, and I know you have a lot to say on these issues, but just one very briefly, a final remark from you, please.
Thanks, Peter. So I think from my side, I do welcome the announcement of this inclusive infrastructure model, and I think it really then is an issue to then look into it to the effect that it puts people first in all infrastructure development interventions. And basically that will be all from my side, because thanks.
Thank you very much, Adrian, particularly for being very brief. I do appreciate it. Allows us to finish just very close to on time. It's clear to me that there's lots of overlap, I think, between the C20, between civil society perspectives and our colleagues in the G20. And where we do differ, I think this event demonstrates that we can have a constructive dialogue on these issues. So please do, Luisa, on behalf of the other panelists, I'm sure, please do report back to your G20 colleagues that we really appreciate this this opportunity to talk to you and share our ideas, and we hope that will continue in future years. So thank you to the panelists. Thank you to all the audience members for joining us, and for our technical team who have been working so hard behind the scenes. I hope you've enjoyed it. You found this stimulating. Go please and have a look at the respective websites of the organizations that have been involved today for much more material and lots more discussion around these ideas contained through their websites. Thank you, everyone. With that, the event is closed. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Have a good one.
Thank you very much.